Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Richard Branson. Losing My Virginity, the autobiography. Chapter 1. Fortunately, our tribute album went on to make millions of pounds and was the biggest single contributor to the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund. And Candle in the Wind ended up by being the largest selling single in the history of music, selling some 33 million copies. What I'd always thought was that Virgin should be more than just a money-making machine, and that as Virgin has the wealth of a small nation, we should use that wealth to tackle social issues more than we had in the past. Companies do have a responsibility to tackle them. Bill Gates, over the last few years, has invested enormous amounts of money trying to develop vaccines to stamp out deadly diseases. Despite the difficult time he's had, and the bad press Microsoft has received, he's given an awful lot back to the community. He's a tremendous example to all other entrepreneurs. When I was last in South Africa, I visited some hospitals, particularly ones in Soweto. It was devastating to see the number of people whose lives have been destroyed by HIV/AIDS, including the millions of orphans who have become heads of households at the ripe old age of 9. After the launch of Mates in the UK, Virgin continued to support a number of organizations in the fight against HIV/AIDS around the world. But after this trip, I vowed that we would in some way do even more to help stop this disease from wiping out entire generations. In Africa, I'm also a supporter of an organization that's trying to make sure that the 2% of Africa currently set aside for wildlife is increased to 4 or 5%, giving the wildlife of Africa more wild areas in which to roam, areas that are not just given over for cattle and farmers. Among my favorite animals in the world are the African wild dogs, a dying breed of animal, which I find fascinating. It would be a fantastic legacy for the next generation if twice as much land as is currently used can be fenced in for wild animals, giving them a greater chance of long-term survival. Another area of the world that has seen more than its fair share of trouble is Northern Ireland. Although there will always be extremists from both factions, Catholic Republicans and Protestant Unionists, by the 1990s the public were increasingly getting tired of years of sectarian bombings and killings. In May 1998, Emo Molam was appointed Northern Ireland Secretary, an inspired choice. Emo is a completely down-to-earth woman who could relate to the ordinary man and woman in the street. She decided to go above the heads of the politicians and directly to the people to hold a referendum on the future of Ireland. If she won, permanent peace was a strong possibility. If she lost, the alternative was to go back to the last 30 years, in which 3,500 people had been murdered. The referendum proposed that Northern Ireland would remain part of Great Britain, but that if one day the majority of citizens of Northern Ireland ever wanted a unified Ireland, and they voted for it, they could have it. 2 days before the vote, the outcome looked uncertain. Emo is an old friend of mine, and she rang me to ask if I would walk the streets with her. I think Emo felt that I was popular in Ireland because of my ballooning and boating adventures, and that I had no political or religious associations. She may also have wanted to send the message that with peace would come prosperity in the form of investment in business. Either way, the next day I set out for Heathrow with one of our PR staff, Wendy, who happened to be from Northern Ireland herself. In the lounge she turned to me and said, "Richard, I'm sorry. I just can't come with you. My dad will kill me if he sees me with you campaigning for this peace treaty." I'd never thought of her as Protestant or Catholic, just a delightful Irish girl. It brought home to me just what a difficult job Mo had ahead of her. In the end, I persuaded Wendy to come. She bravely stayed with Mo and me for the rest of the day. By the end of the day, Wendy was so convinced by the arguments that she decided to vote yes, and also persuaded her mother and sisters to vote yes as well. Unfortunately, she realized her dad was a lost cause. That night, having walked the streets of Northern Ireland and shaken hundreds of hands, we all went back to Hillsborough Castle, the Northern Ireland Secretary's beautiful residence, for dinner and bed to await the outcome. At least I knew my trip had secured 4 extra votes. The next day the good news came through. The yes vote had been won. Peace finally had come to Ireland. Since it was a peace voted by the people this time, it felt like it just might hold. In my life, I've come to expect the unexpected. It sounds easy enough to say, but all the things that have happened to me, to the family, and to Virgin have taught me that you have to be prepared at all times to deal with surprises. You just develop a way of picking up your feet and getting on with it. But nothing I've ever faced made me ready for what happened on September 11, 2001. It was 3:15 in the afternoon in Brussels, and I was about to stand up to address yet another European Union inquiry into competition. I've sat through dozens of meetings like this, and there was nothing out of the ordinary about that September day. The same gray suits, it seemed, sat there ranged against us. I knew the strength of our position, so I was already thinking ahead of that meeting, about getting home, settling back into the routine at work, after a summer break with the family on Necker. This time it was not about an airline, nor was it about the music business, retailing, or the railways. It was about the incredibly interesting subject of block exemption for European car manufacturers. In other words, about the fact that the people who make cars rip us all off by controlling who sells them, and at what price they're sold on to us. I was there because as the years rolled on, and the world of the internet and call centers lowered the cost of distribution, it had become possible for Virgin to sell and deliver cars direct to the public at prices up to 25% cheaper than the corner garage. In the previous year, we had sold more than 6,000. As I was about to launch into a withering attack on the vested interests of those who were sitting all around me in the room, someone quietly handed a note to the chairman, who looked up with an ashen face, and announced to the shocked room that there had been a terrorist attack in New York, which involved a number of aircraft. He then asked me if I wished to continue. None of us there knew quite how serious things were, but they did not sound good. There was also some concern that the European Union building could be a target. Nonetheless, I decided to carry on, deliver the speech, and answer questions from the members of the European Parliament, knowing full well that everyone's mind would be on New York. An hour later, I was about to board a Eurostar train back to HQ, when I finally managed to get through to London. It looks like Middle Eastern terrorists took over 4 aircraft, Will said. The Twin Towers have just come down, and there could be over 10,000 dead. Reports are also coming in of other aircraft being hijacked. They've closed U.S. airspace. In your absence, we turned the planes back. Only 3 had passed the point of no return. Since then, they've shut U.S. airspace. I suggest we talk in more detail once you're back, and all gather tomorrow morning first thing at Holland Park. As I sat on the train with the chief executive of Virgin Cars, the full horror began to sink in. There was a woman sitting opposite us who was a banker, and was frantically phoning friends in London and knew York to find out what she could. She began to give us a blow-by-blow account of what she knew, that the brokers Cantor Fitzgerald had been completely wiped out, that several French and American banks may have had severe casualties. Her distress was evident, and I did what I could to help her. I still had not seen any pictures, but I could tell from her tears just how awful things were. Only that morning, I'd run my mind over how the businesses were going. In the run-up to September 11th, Virgin Atlantic had continued its remarkable success story. Singapore Airlines had become our partners, paying a record £600 million for a 49% stake in March 2000, and we had remained the only profitable airline flying across the North Atlantic in 2001. The business felt so good that year, as others struggled with out-of-control costs, unfriendly service, and aging fleets. Indeed, I felt so confident about the business that I had continued expanding by starting a new airline in Australia, almost exactly a year to the day before the Twin Towers tragedy. It is called Virgin Blue, and was based on the low-cost model of Southwest Airlines. Despite the weak Australian dollar and high fuel costs, it had thrived, driving airfares down and doubling the number of people flying on its routes. This was not the only new investment of the previous few years. We had done a lot to rationalize Virgin and its brand in the late 1990s, and by September 11th, we had a clear strategy in place, based on the concept of branded venture capital. Instead of being a conglomerate with lots of subsidiaries, Virgin had become a diverse investor. So we'd choose business sectors carefully, trying to bring more competition to sectors that would benefit the consumer. Then we'd find good partners and managers to take the businesses forward, with the eventual aim of letting them stand on their own 2 feet, just as companies like Virgin Records and Virgin Radio had already done. But we were also turning our attention to whether we could make a difference in other areas. For nearly 250 days of the year, I'd travel around the world, trying to make Virgin the most respected brand in the world. Not necessarily the biggest, but the best. We had also built a great management team, both at UK and international levels, that could act as our eyes and ears across all the businesses. So the new investments had come at breakneck speed over the previous couple of years. Virgin Active had become the world's 3rd largest health club chain. The train selling rail tickets via the internet across all the networks, had 5 million customers by September 11th. Virgin Mobile was Europe's fastest-growing mobile phone company and, on the fateful day, was on the verge of doing a deal with Sprint to take our no-nonsense mobile offer to the American public. As part of the expansion of mobile, we had also finally consigned the Our Price brand to the dustbin of history. Since we had bought the business from W. H. Smith in 1998, we had taken the decision to rebrand it as Virgin to sit alongside the successful megastore chain. It and Virgin's other presence on the high street helped Virgin Mobile to achieve nearly 2 million customers by the beginning of 2002, and now over 5 million customers. One of the first things I checked, on hearing about the terrorist attacks, was whether or not anyone we knew had been involved. Frances Farrow, who had worked for us on the airline business over here, and then moved to New York to marry her fiancé, only that spring, lived near the Twin Towers. She was helping out on the deal with Sprint for Virgin Mobile. We lost contact with her for 3 days. Later, we found out that she'd been driving near the World Trade Center, just as the first tower started to fall. Luckily for us, all the other relatives and friends called to let us know they were okay. But it wasn't the same for so many others. And I had a taste of this when I was called by Howard Lutnick, the chairman of Cantors, as they were known in the city. On the Friday night, James Kyle of Cantor Fitzgerald, the firm that had lost literally hundreds of employees in the tragedy, had called Will Whitehorn. They urgently needed to fly dozens of grieving relatives to New York, but, since their entire operation had been wiped out, they did not know whether they would have a business, when the markets reopened, to pay the bill. On the Saturday morning we agreed to carry as many people as they needed across the Atlantic. Whatever problems we had, it was so very much worse for them. Howard rang that afternoon to thank me personally. I couldn't begin to imagine what a hellish time he was having, facing the loss of most of his close colleagues. "Thanks for everything you're doing for us," he said. "It means a lot to everyone at Cantors." I felt embarrassed that we could do only this much, especially when I learned, after his emotional and gracious phone call, that his own brother Gary had died in the devastating attack. I see from my diary entry on the computer for September 12th that all it says is RB, meeting all day at Holland Park. And it was a gloomy group of us who met in my house that morning. Present in the sitting room were Richard Boker, Patrick McCall, Will Whitehorn, Mark Poole and Simon Wright. Ironically, nobody was there from Virgin Atlantic. Steve Ridgway, the managing director, and his senior team had already enacted their emergency procedures and begun an urgent 72-hour review of the entire business, with a view to making recommendations by the Friday of that week as to what we should do. But all of us sitting around the table in Holland Park knew we were going to have to do something fast. With transatlantic routes closed to us, and the sudden drop-off in passenger numbers, Virgin Atlantic was set to lose £1.5 million a day. That morning I had spoken to BA's new boss, a delightful Australian called Rod Eddington, who had told me that BA could lose up to £8 million a day. I suggested that we work together in our approach to government to see what assistance we might get once American airspace opened again. I was heartened by his straightforward reply. "Good on ya, mate. I'll call you at the start of next week." The fact that BA may have been in even worse trouble than we were wasn't much consolation to the six of us sitting around my drawing room table in the bright September sunshine. As we drew up lists of what we were up against, it was clear that we had enough cash in the various companies to see ourselves through the worst, but that the potential black hole at Virgin Atlantic needed to be plugged as quickly as possible. The other uncertainty was what was going to happen to our competitors. We knew that Sabina in Brussels and Ansett in Australia were going into administration, but would they survive? That weekend, the plans we'd had ready for such an emergency were used for the first time. The team at Virgin Atlantic did a fantastic job in their assessment of the market failure between the UK and the USA, and as a result, drew up an emergency restructuring plan. There were some painful bits to this. More than 1,200 jobs would go at the airline in the UK, but they did what they could to make the thousands of others secure. Most importantly, they switched larger aircraft, such as the 747-400s, onto booming routes in Africa, and put the smaller Airbuses into service across the North Atlantic. On the Sunday morning we pressed the button to go ahead with the restructuring and told the staff on the Monday. I will never forget the good grace and professionalism with which they took the news, and then got on with the job. The months that followed were sticky, but we had called it right in the first week. By Christmas it was clear that Virgin Atlantic was through the worst, and would survive. This was no mean feat given that our American competitors went cap in hand to their government and received massive cash handouts from them. This may be what got them through, but all we saw was that it gave them leeway to behave more anti-competitively than they usually do. The irony of the situation was this: not only had we built up such a fantastic team of people, but, until September 11th, we'd been profitable. My biggest worry at that point was how morale in the business would react to these enforced redundancies. It was a testament to everybody involved that, not only did a lot of the older and part-time staff come forward and volunteer, but those who stayed really buckled down in the spirit that undoubtedly made Virgin Atlantic what it is today. The innovative nature of the airline, using bed seats and in-flight masseurs to make passengers more comfortable, now meant ironically that we were the first to install bulletproof Kevlar cockpit doors to further ensure passengers' safety. It would have been harder for Virgin Atlantic's management to be as single-minded as they were if they had to worry about short-haul operations as well, but under Virgin's investment model, they didn't have to. We have two other airlines, Virgin Express in Brussels and Virgin Blue in Brisbane, Australia, both of which are separately run and publicly quoted. The effects of September 11th on these businesses were entirely different, but equally challenging. In the case of one, it faced the collapse of the main state-owned carrier, and the other the collapse of its main competitor. Both have had to move quickly to reshape and grow their businesses. In each case, they were able to focus completely on their own issues. Similarly, Virgin Mobile faced challenges early in the 21st century: growth in the UK market, a recession in Singapore, and the decision as to whether or not to press the button to expand in the US. If Virgin Mobile were one conglomerate, there could have been paralysis in these decisions, but, as each is under a separate joint venture structure, once again the management teams could concentrate on the job in hand. By October, we took the momentous decision to go ahead with launching Virgin Mobile in the US in partnership with Sprint, and began a fundraising exercise to help finance the $500 million venture. This was not as daft as it may seem. It was clear that the US economy was going into recession, but what was also clear was that mobile phone sales were finally starting to boom in America after the uncertainties that followed the tragedy of September 11th. Virgin's low-cost model of prepaid phones seemed an ideal solution to help attract a youth market, one that had not warmed to mobiles and text messaging in the way that the European, African, and Asian youth markets had. Within another 2 weeks, on October 7th, the war against the terrorists started in earnest as the bombs and cruise missiles started to rain down on their enclaves in Afghanistan. It's always hard to stay focused at times like these, as I knew from the first Gulf War, but people still had jobs to go to. So it was another shock when Virgin Rail Group's biggest supplier, Railtrack, went bust. It was a blow to the railway-using public and to Virgin, which was at the time trying to negotiate a deal to save the upgrade of the West Coast Main Line. Yet again, the consequences were quickly understood by a dedicated management team, who did not have to worry about the rest of some amorphous PLC's other activities. However, another shock was to follow when the government pinched Richard Boker to become head of the Strategic Rail Authority. As co-chairman of Virgin Rail, he had done a fantastic job in coordinating our new train orders, as was proved when the first of our tilting trains were delivered from the factory, on time and to budget, in November 2001. By way of contrast, Railtrack's cost for the upgrade had gone up fourfold, and was going to end up being years late. It was a proud and tearful moment, standing in the Alstom factory in Birmingham on a cold and sunny November day, watching Joan name one of our new trains Virgin Lady. It was an even better moment sitting by the fire that evening watching the 6 o'clock news and hearing the words I had waited 5 years for. Virgin has delivered on its promises. This was no mean feat, as the orders had been placed in 1998, and despite all the technological difficulties, Virgin had produced the world's most advanced train, which tilted round corners at speeds of up to 140 miles per hour. Of course, the sting in the tail was that the track would not be ready for 125 miles per hour operation until 2004. The winter of 2001 saw yet more midnight oil being burned by Virgin Rail's finance team as they negotiated with Railtrack, its administrators, the Strategic Rail Authority, the Department of Transport, and the train suppliers to ensure that our trains got the track they deserve, and the public the service it deserves. I thought how ironic it was that every critic of our deal to upgrade the railway in 1997 had predicted that we would never get the new trains to work, and that we would go bust in the process of trying. As it was, about the only tangible successes of privatization were Virgin's electric Pendolinos and diesel Voyagers. The railway experts who had also predicted in 1997 that upgrading the track would be easier than the trains were dumbfounded. Meanwhile, in Australia, the effects of September 11th continued to be felt in the airline business. Following the collapse of Ansett, Virgin Blue suddenly found itself Australia's second-largest airline. Its chief executive, Brett Godfrey, had been steadily building the business for a year, but almost overnight was running an airline that promised to be more profitable than EasyJet and had enormous opportunities, if only he could raise the finance. Our corporate finance director, Patrick McCall, was on a plane to Australia within 3 days of the Twin Towers attack. 1 month later, Virgin Blue had announced the appointment of Goldman Sachs to prepare for a flotation in 2003, with a potential valuation being talked about of over $1 billion. It nearly did not turn out this way, as Ansett's parent company, Air New Zealand, had made an offer to buy Virgin Blue for $250 million shortly before September 11th. Our friends at Singapore Airlines had a 20% stake in ANZ, so it was the CEO, Dr. Chong, who telephoned me to make the offer. "Richard, I really think you should accept this offer," he said. "It is a very generous valuation, and if you don't take it, we'll put the money into Ansett instead, and they will wipe out Virgin Blue within 6 months." Was he bluffing? It was a difficult decision. My instinct told me that the company was worth more than that, but it wasn't an ungenerous offer. However, there was something in the desperate insistence in CK's voice on the long-distance phone line that made me hesitate. I decided to be a little mischievous and to call a press conference. I wanted the competition authorities to understand how strongly the public felt about the need for healthy competition. I announced with a somber and straight face, "This is a sad day, but I've decided to sell up. This means that cheap air tickets in Australia will be a thing of the past. Others won't want to follow what we try to do. It will, of course, mean that our staff will be part of Ansett, and that there will be redundancies. But anyway, I've done well out of it, so I'm off back to the UK right away with my $250 million profit." There was a deadly hush, and the packed room seemed in deep shock. A journalist from the Press Association rushed off to file her copy. And then I caught sight of some of our staff across the room, who were not meant to be at the press conference. I realized they were in tears. Only joking, I added quickly, and publicly tore up the $250 million check. 5 days later, Ansett went bust and Brett could barely contain himself on the phone as he enthusiastically outlined his plans for rapid expansion of what had become, overnight, Australia's second largest airline. It was that call that made me realize that Brett's team had built a truly virgin business. It had revolutionized the market for Australian air travel. It had built a fantastic reputation for quality. And all this had been done as a small-scale venture capital startup, with only $10 million. By December 2003, this $10M startup had captured over 30% of the market and was the first of our new generation of companies to float. This was a remarkable achievement given the chaos in the aviation market and the tragic terrorist attack in Bali the previous year, which had dented Australians' confidence in their immunity from the problems of the rest of the world. By the time we took the company public on the Australian stock market, we had a new partner in Virgin Blue called Chris Corrigan, and with his investment and the float, we had made over $780 million in just over 3 years of trading. After the float, Virgin retained a 25% stake, and the company continued to prosper for over 18 months, until Qantas finally woke up to the destruction of their domestic market. And like all good monopolists, they launched a low-quality clone of Virgin Blue in the spring of 2004 called Jetstar. By January 2005, Virgin Blue was locked in a price war. Despite this, Virgin Blue is still one of the world's most profitable airlines. Indeed, one of the remarkable achievements of 2004-05 was that Virgin Blue and Virgin Atlantic both remained profitable at a time when most of the U.S. airlines finally went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Even our newer .com businesses, those launched since 1998, seemed to go from strength to strength after September 11th, largely because they were modeled on a real brand, selling real things. Virgin Cars sold its 6,000th vehicle that winter, and, despite a blip after the New York attacks, car sales actually improved in the run-up to Christmas. The same was true of again, sales rocketed as nervous executives decided that a train from Manchester or Newcastle was a better bet than a plane. By the beginning of 2002, these, and several other of our e-commerce businesses, had turned cash flow positive. There was only one exception, Virgin Wines, which, despite winning 100,000 customers, still could not get the margins it needed in a cutthroat market. But we're confident that it will turn the corner soon enough. Virgin Wines was a good example of our management philosophy, of giving our people the chance to become entrepreneurs in their own right. Rowan Gormley, of Virgin Money, had begun to feel by the end of 1999 that our financial services business was maturing and needed a different sort of manager. The former venture capitalist had been bitten by the entrepreneurial bug and simply wanted to start something new, an online wine retailer. I sympathized with him, and in spite of our misgivings about entering such a different sector, we decided to back him almost as a matter of principle. Virgin Wines was established as a joint venture by Virgin and Rowan. I could go on, but hopefully the point is well made. By investing in separate businesses with partners, ring-fenced, as the bankers keep telling me, we had been able to withstand the management pressures of September 11th, spread risk, and take what we hope have been a lot of good decisions. Couple these with a venture capital private equity model of creating individual companies with their own business case, shareholders and financial resources, and you have the Virgin that existed in 2001 and continues to exist now. It's been interesting, with the collapse of Enron, to see how people still want to build enormous companies. But if something major goes wrong, the whole lot falls. What we are trying to do at Virgin is not to have one enormous company in one sector under one banner, but to have 200 or even 300 separate companies. Each company can stand on its own feet, and in that way, although we've got a brand that links them, if we were to have another tragedy, such as that of September 11th, which hurt the airline industry, it would not bring the whole group crashing down. So we've managed to avoid the danger that we might wake up one day with one awful thing going wrong that threatens to bring all the companies down. As it turns out, we've never let a company go. We've always paid off its debts. We've always managed to keep our reputation as an organization that honors its obligations. But in the event of an absolute catastrophe, we could let a company go. We could cut it out, and because of that, the rest of the group would not be affected. Obviously, our reputation would suffer, and we wouldn't want it to happen, but at least it would avoid a disaster and the loss of 40,000 jobs. The sheer diversity of Virgin's businesses has proved the test of time and circumstance. With each management team focused on its own business and entrepreneurial goals, we can achieve just about anything, as long as it is right for the brand. I had learned a lot in the late 1990s, and I had come to realize that sticking our name on products was not the best way to create value. Virgin Vodka might sell well on the planes and at the airports, but we did not have the worldwide distribution of firms, such as UDV or Scottish Courage, to back it up. However, find entrepreneurial managers like Frank Reed and Matthew Bucknall at Virgin Active, and give them the resources, and the sky will be the limit. The omens were not good when Virgin Active opened its first club in Preston, Lancashire, in August 1999. A fire swept through the club, doing tens of thousands of pounds worth of damage, and a distraught Frank phoned me to give me the bad news. However, one can often turn bad news into good news. When he said it would give them a chance to do one or two things differently, and have longer to train the staff, I was relieved. I was also beginning to get the measure of why Frank had such a strong reputation in the leisure industry. At the same time, Frank helped me fulfill a pledge of many years, standing to invest in South Africa. One of the first casualties of the stock market decline that preceded the Twin Towers attack was a quoted South African company that happened to own the country's largest chain of health clubs. I was in the bath when Nelson Mandela called and explained that it would be a particular blow to have 80 health clubs, owned through a black empowerment scheme, closed down with the loss of several thousand jobs. He asked whether we could rescue it and save those people's livelihoods. We could, and we did, so that by the end of 2001, Virgin Active had mushroomed through growth and acquisitions into one of the top 5 health club operators in the world. In the years that followed, Virgin Active became one of the silent success stories of the Virgin Empire. Even internally, very few people knew how well it was doing. We brought venture capital partners into the business, and, by the beginning of 2005, it was making a profit of £34 million a year. Our method of expansion through branded venture capital may not suit everyone, but it is heartening to see that one entrepreneur is now following a not too dissimilar model. EasyJet has been so successful that it now has a stock market quote, and its entrepreneurial founder, Stelios Hadjiioannou, is developing new businesses using the same brand, such as EasyCar, through his separate private venture capital vehicle Easy Group. In the aftermath of the attacks of September 11th, Virgin Atlantic has completely restructured its operations. Whilst BA's main response was to wrap itself in the Union Jack and pursue the government to back yet another attempt for it to create a transatlantic monopoly with American Airlines. Instead of trying to prevent more than 60% of U.S. airline traffic and slots at Heathrow from falling into the hands of one monolithic structure, it was clear that the British Department of Transport was going to help. On a warm and sunny November day in Washington, while I was presenting our case against the deal in front of the Senate, the Transport Department's hypocrisy was brought home to me. The British Embassy put out a press release supporting the merger and an attendant open skies deal. Amazing considering the only beneficiaries were likely to be the two airlines creating the monopoly. With considerable pomposity, our diplomats tried to capture the pro-British mood on Capitol Hill with the words, "Two allies, united in so much else, should be able to reach agreement on something that would be to their mutual benefit." If anyone could have told me what mutual benefit the attempt to create a North Atlantic airline monopoly had for two allies locked in conflict with the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, I would happily have given them a free upper-class ticket for life. That was not the end of it, though. In trying to defend the deal, BA made the ludicrous claim in the Sunday Telegraph that there was no shortage of slots at Heathrow. This was, in the immortal words of Sid Vicious, bollocks. Virgin responded by offering to give £2 million to charity for every slot that Lord Marshall managed to procure for us. Naturally, he was unable to rise to the challenge, and he must have groaned when the United States Department of Justice slammed the deal as anti-competitive and confirmed that its investigations concluded that the shortage of slots was a major reason why the deal should not go ahead as proposed. It was not until late January 2002 that BA's game with American Airlines finally played itself out. The U.S. Department of Transport announced that it would let the two monopolists merge their operations if BA gave up slots to the other American carriers. The problem was the price. The U.S. regulators realized that Heathrow was overcrowded and that they would have to give their airlines a lot of access as the price of the deal. For BA, though, the price was too high. In the last week of January, they abandoned their merger plans and went back to the drawing board on the whole open skies issue. Since the start of their attempted merger in 1996, BA had wasted thousands of man-hours, not to mention tens of millions of pounds, on a hopeless scheme, more in tune with the 1970s view of the airline business than the modern world of deregulation, competition, and low-cost airlines. Rod Eddington wisely bit the bullet, and instead of trying to create a monopoly to get out of difficulties, announced the Future Size and Shape project to restructure BA. One of the things I've learned over my years in business is that, once you have a great product, it is essential to protect its reputation with vigilance. It's not just a question of getting it into the marketplace. As a result, every day I receive a bundle of press cuttings, everything that mentions Virgin. These and staff letters are the first things I read in the morning. When I launched the airline, I realized that I would have to use myself to raise the profile of Virgin Atlantic and build the value of the brand. Most companies don't acknowledge the press and have a tiny press office tucked away out of sight. If an inaccurate story appears in the press and is allowed to run for more than one issue of the paper, it becomes fact. Then, every time your product is mentioned, this same story will be repeated. My reputation has been threatened on two major occasions, first by British Airways, which I've covered in detail, and second by Guy Snowden and his company G-Tech. the driving force behind the creation of Camelot, which won the franchise to run the British National Lottery. For both companies, I was a spanner in the works, costing them millions of pounds in lost earnings. The GTEC incident was a particularly crucial one, in terms of reputation. I met Guy Snowden in 1993 when the British government had finally agreed to go ahead with the National Lottery. Various commercial consortia were beginning to form, but I felt strongly that the lottery should be run by a company that would donate all the profits to charity. This would be possible because it would be a monopoly with no risk involved at all. I had asked John Jackson, with whom I had worked on the Healthcare Foundation when he was chief executive of Body Shop, and with whom I had launched Mates Condoms, to pull together our charitable bid. GTEC was the leading supplier of lottery equipment, so we thought that we should meet them to see whether they would be interested in supplying us in the event that their consortium failed to win the contract. John Jackson and I met with Guy Snowden for lunch on September 24th. The conversation we had has since become the stuff of legal legend. After we reached a stalemate, in that Guy Snowden didn't want a quote for supplying equipment to us, and I didn't want to join his consortium, there was a pause. Then Snowden pointed out to us that if we went ahead with our bid, it would cost the GTEC consortium millions of pounds, since they would have to reduce the percentage they were going to charge as the operators from the 15% of turnover mentioned in the government guidelines to 13% and possibly lower. Assuming that the annual sales of lottery tickets reached £4 billion, each percentage reduction of the operator's slice was worth £40 million a year. There was a great deal of money at stake. We were sitting in the conservatory in the garden at 11 Holland Park, and I noticed that Snowden began to sweat. He shifted in his seat and looked at me. I do not quite know how to phrase this, Richard. I looked across at him, wondering what he was going to say. There's always a bottom line. I will get to the point. In what way can we help you, Richard? I didn't know what to say. Snowden clarified his intentions. I mean, how can we help you personally? My mind reeled at the question. I was being offered a bribe. What on earth do you mean? I said, astonished and angry, and trying to give him the chance to stop. But he didn't. Everybody needs something in life, Snowden said. Thank you, I answered. I'm quite successful. I only need one breakfast, one lunch and one dinner a day. The only way you could have helped was by providing technical services for our bid. And with that I stood up and left the conservatory. I wanted no further part in this man's world. While John and I were trying to pull together a bid for the National Lottery that was intended to give many millions of pounds to charity, this man was trying to bribe me to stand aside and enable his bid to go through, which, as well as giving less money to charity, would simultaneously enrich him and his company. I bounded down the stairs and into the loo. There I scribbled the words he had used onto a piece of paper. I had never been offered a bribe before. Then I went back upstairs, and John and I ushered Snowden out of the house. I wasn't mistaken, was I? I asked John. That was a bribe, wasn't it? It most certainly was, John told me. Later, John told me how he nearly fell off his chair when Guy Snowden said those words. To cut a long story short, in the court case that ensued, the jury found in my favor against Guy Snowden and GTEC. In his summing up, the late George Carman QC pointed out to the court that, above any commercial success one might enjoy once. Reputation for honesty is the most important thing. Guy Snowden had picked the wrong man, said the wrong thing, in the wrong place at the wrong time. I decided in 1999, when the license for the National Lottery again came up for tender, that I would bid once more with a not-for-profit consortium to take over the lottery. I was convinced that New Labour's commitment to the not-for-profit approach we had taken in 1993 would ultimately be honored. As before, most of my close Virgin advisors tried to persuade me not to bid because of the risk to the brand that a fight with Camelot, which few of them believed we could win, could do. Nonetheless, I felt so passionately about this that I decided to go ahead and kick things off by picking up the phone to my old friend Simon Borich. He had spent the intervening years at the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency as managing director, but had lost none of his enthusiasm for either the principle of a people's lottery or the inevitable fight with Camelot that would follow the decision. Simon was not a man to mince words. "I've been following things at Camelot very closely, Richard, and all our predictions in the 1993 bid are coming true. Sales are falling like a stone, the G-Tech technology is crap, their games are unexciting, and with the right suppliers I think we can do it." He set to work immediately and brought together everybody from Leach and John Jackson, right the way through to Colin Howes at Harbottle and Lewis. The only exception to the previous team was Will Whitehorn, who again felt strongly that there should be a clear demarcation between Virgin and what was to become known this time round as the People's Lottery. We were in the middle of investing in a whole new range of businesses, which, with the exception of the airline, might not see profits for the first couple of years. Will told me that he thought they would really go for the jugular and try to destroy my business reputation. He wanted to concentrate on fighting that bigger picture, the PR for the group and the brand, and suggested instead using an outside PR agency for the People's Lottery. And so we assembled a new team of suppliers, agencies and people, built around the core team from the 1993 bid. In all, we ended up with more than 20 suppliers, from Energis and Microsoft to J. Walter Thompson, J.P. Morgan and our previous rivals AWI. Camelot, for its part, had brought in the post office as a shareholder to replace the now disgraced G-Tech, although it still intended to bid with its equipment. Camelot had managed to improve one thing during their otherwise lackluster 6 years. They had brought in the formidable Diane Thompson as chief executive. Diane was a good example of the new generation of senior female executives who began to make an impact on Britain's staid boardrooms in the 1990s. I relished the idea of a fight with her, but, having heard her on BBC Radio 4's highly respected Today program several times, giving John Humphreys and Jim Naughty a run for their money, I knew she would not be a pushover. At the time, I was freshly back from our final, failed, round-the-world balloon attempt of Christmas 1998, and I didn't appreciate one crucial difference between the Camelot of 1993 and that of 1999. Having won the bid to run the lottery, and run it for 6 years, they were prepared to do anything to keep it. More importantly, because most people thought they would win it again, we ended up being the only rival bidder, which meant they could concentrate all their firepower against us. And me personally. The end game played itself out in the summer of 2000, while we were on our family holiday on Necker. A fax arrived from the boss of the Lottery Commission, Dame Helena Shovelton, telling us that we had not won, but we had sort of won. We were given a period of exclusivity to negotiate a deal. If we could guarantee enough money to cover any potential downside and clear up a few points, then the lottery would be ours. If only it had been that simple. Simon and John saw the danger signs fairly early on in the process, and were right in predicting that Camelot could take a judicial review against her decision. They did. And what's more, they won it, which then threw the entire process into chaos that autumn, with the danger of there being no time to hand over the lottery to us. A very bitter Dame Helena resigned and was replaced by Terry Burns, a former Whitehall mandarin. In a few short weeks, Burns reversed Dame Helena's entire approach to the lottery and came to the ludicrous conclusion that the license should go to Camelot. None of us could believe it, and as the weeks went on into 2001, it became clear that the British public could not believe it either. They began to desert Camelot in their thousands. By the time September 11th shook the world, sales were falling at a rate of 20% per year. I took no satisfaction from this, because of course, it was not Camelot that suffered, but rather the many good causes, sport, the arts, charities and other organizations that simply got less money. Camelot's new license to run Britain's national lottery came into effect in January 2002, amid falling numbers of people playing. Diane Thompson, the chief executive, said that this was because people found it boring. How sad that someone who has the job of making many millionaires a week can't make it exciting. It also emerged that Camelot had managed to win the renewal of their license by pledging to raise £15 billion for good causes, but the government hadn't asked them to guarantee this. Within a week of winning, Camelot were publicly looking for excuses as to why they wouldn't raise anything like £15 billion. We were distracted by the bidding process, etc., but it was too late. They had their license. It was a staggering outcome, and one for which I think the government should hang their heads in shame. They had pledged at the election that the lottery would be run with all the profits going to good causes, and they'd reneged on that pledge.
Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.